The phone on my kitchen wall rang at 6:14 in the morning, and the man on the other end asked me why my mortgage payment was 90 days past due. I did not have a mortgage. I had paid off that house 11 years earlier, in cash, the same month I buried my wife. And yet, here was a stranger from a collections office reading me a loan number, a balance of $380,000, and a warning that foreclosure proceedings would begin within 30 days if the count was not brought current. I asked him to repeat the name on the loan. He read it back to me slowly, like he was doing me a favor. It was my name. My signature was on file, my social security number was on file, and the phone number listed as the primary contact for that loan, the number he had just dialed at 6 in the morning, was the same landline that had been bolted to my kitchen wall since 1989. 12 years later, I would learn that my own son had forged that signature while I was still numb with grief over his mother's death, had drained the equity out of the one thing I owned free and clear, had walked away from the payments the moment his business collapsed, and had let the debt fall silently back onto a 73-year-old man he assumed would never find out. Before I tell you exactly how I found out, and exactly what I did about it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe a man's home is the last thing anyone should ever be allowed to steal from him, hit like and subscribe. My name is Walter Doyle. I am 73 years old now, and I am telling you this story from the quiet of a study that overlooks a city I once thought I would die in poverty in. But on the morning that phone rang, I was still just a widower standing barefoot on cold linoleum, holding a receiver in a hand that had started to shake, listening to a stranger describe a debt I had never signed for, on a house I had already paid for once. I want to take you back further than that morning, though, because you cannot understand the size of the betrayal without understanding the size of the trust that came before it. 11 years before that phone call, my wife Eleanor died on a Tuesday in March after a 2-year fight, with a heart condition that had slowly stolen the color out of her cheeks and the strength out of her hands. I had been married to her for 34 years. I did not know how to exist in a house without her voice in it. For the first 3 weeks after the funeral, I barely left the bedroom. I did not open mail. I did not answer calls. I did not eat unless someone put a plate in front of me. My son Derek did. He showed up every day that first month, and I was grateful for it in a way I cannot fully describe to you now, knowing what I know. He made coffee I did not drink. He sat with me in silence, and he told me, gently, that he was going to start handling the paperwork because Mom had always handled the paperwork, and I shouldn't have to think about insurance forms and property tax notices on top of everything else. I said thank you. I meant it with my whole broken heart. What I did not know was that Derek's fitness franchise business, 4 locations he had opened over the previous 6 years using a business loan and most of his savings, was already collapsing. Membership numbers were down. 2 locations were behind on rent. He owed money to a regional bank, to 2 former business partners, and to a private lender who did not send polite letters when payments were missed. He never told me any of this, not once. He came to my house every day that spring wearing the calm, steady face of a devoted son, and underneath it he was drowning. About 5 weeks after Eleanor's funeral, Derek sat with me at the kitchen table with a stack of papers he said needed my signature. He told me they were routine. Life insurance closeout forms, a property reassessment following Eleanor's passing, since the house had been held jointly. A limited power of attorney, he said, just so he could keep helping me with the bank and the utility companies, without me having to drag myself out of the house while I was still grieving. I signed every page. I did not read a single one closely. My eyes kept sliding off the words. I remember Derek's hand resting on my shoulder while I signed, telling me I was doing great, that he would take care of everything from here. What I had actually signed, buried in the middle of that stack, was a limited power of attorney with broad financial authority, and an application to open a home equity line of credit against a house that had been paid off in full since 1987. Derek took that signed application to a private lending firm 2 counties over, one that specialized in fast approvals and did not ask too many questions about a borrower's mental state 5 weeks after his wife's funeral. Within 3 weeks, $380,000 had been drawn against my house and deposited into an account controlled by my son. He used it to cover 2 years of back rent across his failing locations, to pay off the private lender who had been threatening him, and to open a fifth location that he was certain, absolutely certain, would turn the whole business around. It did not turn around. 18 months later, all 5 locations were closed. Derek and his wife Renee sold their own house before the bank could take it, packed up my 17-year-old granddaughter Mia and whatever furniture would fit in a moving truck, and relocated across the state line, where Derek took a sales job and quietly, deliberately, stopped making the payments on a loan that had never legally belonged to him in the first place. He knew exactly what would happen. He knew the loan was still in my name. He knew that when the payments stopped, the collections calls would eventually come looking for the man whose signature was on the paperwork. He simply made a calculation that I was old, that I was still grieving, that I was unlikely to fight, and that whatever damage landed on me would be smaller than the damage that would land on him if he stayed and faced it himself. For 2 years, nothing happened. The lender had apparently made repeated attempts to reach Derek at a phone number that no longer worked, and it took their internal systems far too long to update the file with what should have been the borrower's actual contact number, mine, the landline in the kitchen he'd used on the original application. When they finally sorted it out, they came looking for the person legally responsible for the debt. That was the morning the phone rang at 6:14, and I found out, all at once, exactly what my son had done with my grief. I did not scream at the man on the phone. I do not think I said much of anything at all. I wrote down a case number with a pen that kept slipping in my fingers, and I told him I would call back once I understood what I was looking at. Then I sat down at the same kitchen table where I had signed those papers 2 years earlier, and I stayed there until the sun came up completely, staring at the wall. I want you to understand something about the man I was that morning, because he is not the man telling you this story now. That morning I was still soft. I still wanted there to be an explanation. I told myself Derek must not have known. I told myself there had been some kind of mistake at the bank, some clerical error, some identity mix-up. I drove to the branch that afternoon, still halfway believing I would walk out with an apology and a corrected file. I did not get an apology. I got a loan officer named Priya who pulled up my file, turned her monitor toward me, and showed me my own signature on a document dated 5 weeks after my wife's funeral, next to a notarization stamp from a mobile notary service Derek had hired to come to my house that same week. She showed me the disbursement records, $380,000, wired out within 3 weeks of the loan closing, to an account that, when I later had it traced, belonged to Derek's franchise holding company. I sat in that bank lobby for a long time after Priya walked away to give me privacy. An older man in a cardigan, sitting 2 chairs down from me, must have noticed my face, because he asked if I was all right. I told him, more honestly than I had told anyone in years, that I had just found out my son had stolen my house out from under me while I was burying my wife. That man's name was Gus Alvarez. He had spent 31 years as a loan officer himself before retiring, and he told me something that afternoon that I have never forgotten. He said, "Son, the paperwork isn't the crime. The paperwork is just where they finally left a fingerprint. The crime happened at your kitchen table, when he decided your grief was easier to steal from than his own failure was to admit." Gus became the closest thing to a chorus in my life over the following years, a man who had seen 100 versions of exactly what had happened to me and who understood, better than any lawyer I hired, how quietly and how legally a family member can dismantle an elderly parent's entire financial life. He sat with me while I called the lender back. He helped understand the 90-day foreclosure clock that was already running. He was the one who first said the word predatory out loud, and the one who told me that if I didn't act within the next 4 weeks, I was going to lose the house Eleanor and I had raised our son in, over a debt I never agreed to. I hired a lawyer that same week. His name was Mark Webb, a sharp, quiet man in his 40s who had built a small practice specifically around elder financial exploitation cases, The kind of cases most large firms considered too small and too sad to bother with. Marcus looked at the notarization records, the power of attorney language, the disbursement trail, and told me something that both broke my heart further and saved my life at the same time. He said the forgery itself might be provable, but proving it in court, freezing the foreclosure, and unwinding $380,000 of debt was going to take months, possibly years, and there was a real chance I could still lose the house before any of it was resolved. I asked him what I was supposed to do in the meantime. Marcus told me the truth. He said the only thing that reliably beats a predatory system built to crush people exactly like me is money and time, and I had neither. Not yet that night. I sat alone in the house I might lose, at the same kitchen table, and I made a decision that would define the next 12 years of my life. I decided that I was done being a man things happened to. Eleanor was gone. My son had used her death as a tool against me. I had exactly one thing left that no one had managed to take yet, and that was whatever time I had remaining. And I decided I was going to spend every hour of it becoming the kind of man that nothing could ever be quietly stolen from again. The first thing I did was sell the house myself, before the bank could take it from me on their terms instead of mine, and used every dollar of the sale to satisfy the debt and start over with nothing owed to anyone. Gus helped me find a small apartment on the edge of town. I was 61 years old, freshly widowed, publicly humiliated in my own small circle of friends who had heard whispers about the foreclosure notice, and I owned almost nothing. I did not call Derek. Not once. He called me exactly twice in those first months, both times leaving voicemails about needing to talk, about wanting to explain, about how things had gotten complicated. I deleted both without calling back. There was nothing complicated about what he had done. He had looked at his grieving father and decided I was a resource to be liquidated. What Derek did not know, because I made absolutely certain he would never know, was what I did with the small amount of capital I had left after the sale and the debt settlement. Gus, it turned out, had a background not just in lending but in exactly the kind of financial structures that protect assets from ever being touched the way mine had been touched. Together with Marcus, we spent the next year building something small and quiet, a limited investment fund focused on senior housing developments in overlooked mid-sized cities, the kind of unglamorous, steady real estate that nobody in Derek's world would ever think to look for me in. I want to be honest with you about those early years because this is not a story about a man who simply got lucky. I worked. I answered phones in a leasing office at 62 years old. I learned zoning law at an age when most men are learning how to enjoy retirement. I made mistakes that cost me money I could not easily replace, but I never once let anyone from my old life know where I had landed. And I never touched a single dollar without Marcus and Gus reviewing it first, because I had learned, in the most painful way possible, exactly how easily trust can be turned into a weapon. Somewhere around year 4, one of our senior housing developments in a city Derek had never lived in became the anchor for something larger. I will not bore you with every step of how a small recovery fund became Anchor Point Holdings, a company that would eventually manage senior housing and financial protection services in 11 states. What matters is this. By the time I turned 70, I was worth more money than I had ever imagined possible as a younger man, and not one person in my old family knew it. As far as Derek was concerned, his father had lost the house, moved into some small apartment, and quietly faded into an unremarkable old age, exactly as he had assumed I would. He was wrong about that, the same way he had been wrong about almost everything. I kept exactly 3 things from that old life. Kept them in a fireproof lockbox that traveled with me from that first small apartment all the way to the penthouse office I sit in now. The first was Eleanor's wedding ring, which I had removed from her jewelry box myself before the estate was ever touched. The second was the original notarized loan application, the one with my forged signature, which Marcus had insisted we keep as evidence long after the legal urgency had passed. And the third was the pen I had used to sign it, the same pen still sitting in the cup on my kitchen table that terrible morning, which I kept not for sentiment but as a reminder. I never wanted to forget what my own hand had signed while it was being guided by someone I trusted completely. For 12 years, I lived a quiet, guarded, deliberately invisible kind of success. Derek and Renee moved twice more, chasing jobs, always one financial crisis behind the last one. Mia, my granddaughter, grew up almost entirely without me, though I made sure, through channels she never traced back to me, that a small trust quietly covered her school supplies and her class trips over the years, administered anonymously through a scholarship fund Marcus had structured specifically so it could never be linked to my name. I told myself I had made peace with losing my son. I had not. What I had actually done was build a wall high enough that the peace could pretend to be real. And that wall held, solid and unshaken, for 12 entire years. It came down on a Thursday afternoon, when my phone rang for the second time in this story, and the voice on the other end did not belong to a stranger from a collections office. It belonged to my granddaughter, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand the first thing she said to me. Marcus Webb, my chief counsel for going on 10 years now, had a name for the moment I am about to describe. He called it the collision, the exact instant when a life you have carefully kept separate slams back into the one you thought you had escaped. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in my office on the 31st floor, while I was reviewing quarterly numbers for our newest senior housing development outside Denver. My assistant told me my granddaughter was on the line. I had not spoken to Mia directly in almost 4 years, not since a stilted, careful phone call on her 18th birthday that I had made from a blocked number just to hear her voice once. I picked up. Before I could say a word, she was already crying, the kind of crying that comes in waves too fast to control. "Grandpa," she said, is any of this real?" Smaya was 21 now, a senior finishing a business and pre-law degree at a state university 3 states away. She had been assigned a research paper for a seminar on financial exploitation of the elderly, and her professor had told the class to find a real case study, something with public court records they could analyze. Mia had typed in a search for cases involving forged power of attorney and predatory home equity fraud in our old home state, hoping to find something generic to write about. Instead, she found Doyle versus Meridian Lending Group, a case that had quietly settled 12 years earlier and had since been cited, anonymized, in 2 law review articles about elder financial abuse and forged notarization. The articles referenced the borrower only as WD, but the case number was public, and the case number was tied to a property address. Mia recognized the address immediately. It was the house she had spent the first 9 years of her life visiting on holidays. The house with the crooked porch step and the maple tree in the backyard. The house her own father had once told her his father lost through, in Derek's words, bad decisions after Grandma died. She had spent the next 6 hours pulling every public record she could find. The settlement documents, the forensic accounting summary Marcus had filed as part of discovery, which detailed exactly how the loan funds had been wired into Derek's franchise holding company. And then, almost by accident, while searching for updates on the case, she found something that had nothing to do with the old lawsuit at all. She found a business registration filed 8 months earlier for a company called Legacy Bridge Advisory, listing Derek Doyle as founder and managing partner, offering, according to its own marketing materials, financial planning and equity release consulting for seniors. "Grandpa," Mia said, her voice cracking. "I looked up his new company. I looked up who's reviewed it online. There are people, old people, writing that he took equity out of their houses, and the money just disappeared into accounts they can't trace us. There's a woman in Ohio who says she lost her retirement home. Grandpa, he's doing it again. He's doing it to other people now. Is that what he did to you?" I sat completely still, staring out over a skyline I had built a piece of, and I felt something in my chest that I had not let myself feel in 12 years. Not sadness this time. Something colder and far more useful than sadness. I told Mia the truth, all of it, for the first time in her life. I told her about the papers at the kitchen table 5 weeks after her grandmother's funeral. I told her about the phone ringing at 6:14 in the morning. I told her that the man she had grown up believing was a struggling but well-meaning father had, in fact, forged his own dying father's grief into $380,000, and had never once, in 12 years, offered a genuine apology. Only 2 deleted voicemails about things being complicated. I also told her, carefully, what I had built since, not to impress her, to protect her, because I needed her to understand exactly what was about to happen once the rest of the world caught up to what she had already found. It did not take long. Within 18 hours of our call, a financial journalist who had been quietly investigating Legacy Bridge advisory after receiving complaints from 3 separate families, published a piece connecting Derek Doyle's new advisory firm to the 12-year-old Meridian lending case, and to me, Walter Doyle, founder of Anchor Point Holdings, a company that, in one of the strange cruelties of this story, had spent the last decade building senior housing developments and funding legal aid for exactly the kind of elder financial abuse victims my own son was now creating. My phone began ringing before I had even finished reading the article. Not the landline. My cell, my private office line, numbers Derek should never have had access to but apparently still remembered, or had gotten from Mia's old childhood contacts, or had simply guessed by calling every number associated with my old name he could dig up. Within 12 hours, I had over 200 missed calls, some from Derek, some from Renee, a few, chillingly, from numbers I did not recognize at all, which Marcus later traced back to 2 of the private investors Derek had recruited into Legacy Bridge, men who had apparently just discovered that the wealthy Walter Doyle everyone was suddenly talking about in the press was the same father their business partner had defrauded over a decade earlier, and who were beginning, quite reasonably, to panic about where their own money had actually gone. I let almost all of them go to voicemail. I listened to exactly one, from Derek, late that first night. His voice had none of the calm, steady warmth I remembered from the week after his mother's funeral. It was fast, breathless, and underneath the panic, I could hear the same cold calculation I imagine he had used 12 years earlier while I signed those papers. Dad, listen, I know this looks bad, I know the timing looks terrible, but you have to let me explain before you talk to anyone, before you talk to the press, before you talk to a lawyer. We're family. Whatever happened before, whatever you think happened, we can figure this out together. Just call me back. Please, before you do anything. I did not call him back. Instead, I called Marcus and I called Gus, and I asked them both to meet me in my office within the hour. What we discovered over the following 2 weeks, working with the same journalist, and eventually with investigators from the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, was far worse than a single desperate father defrauding his own dying wife's grief-stricken widower. Legacy Bridge Advisory had, over 8 months, targeted at least 11 elderly homeowners across 3 states, using a strategy that was, in a horrifying way, a polished, professionalized version of exactly what Derek had done to me. Free financial seminars at community centers and senior living facilities, warm and reassuring in tone, followed by private consultations where trusted family members were gently encouraged to help their aging parents streamline their finances and unlock equity for a more comfortable retirement. In at least 4 documented cases, forged or improperly witnessed power of attorney documents had been used to open home equity lines that were then drained within weeks, the funds funneled through shell accounts that eventually, through a trail Marcus's forensic team spent days reconstructing, led back to Derek and 2 business partners, who had apparently learned his methods from him directly. Gus, sitting across from me with a printed copy of the fraud pattern laid out on my desk, tapped the page and said something I have not been able to forget since. The first time, Walter, I could almost believe he told himself a story where he was going to pay it back, where it was just borrowing, where he was desperate and not evil. This, he said, gesturing at the 11 names, this isn't desperation anymore. This is a business model. He turned what he did to you into a product and he's been selling it. Renee, I learned from the investigators, had known, not from the very beginning, but for at least the last 5 months. She had helped manage Legacy Bridge's client-facing materials, the warm, trustworthy branding, the smiling stock photos of elderly hands being held by younger, caring hands. She had watched her husband build a business out of the exact wound he had opened in his own father, and she had helped him dress it up in language soft enough that grieving families never saw the blade underneath. Maya, meanwhile, was unraveling in real time, watching her research paper turn into a criminal investigation into her own parents. I flew out to see her in person for the first time in years, sat with her in a small coffee shop near her campus, and told her the same thing Gus had once told me in that bank lobby 12 years earlier. The paperwork isn't the crime. The crime happens at the kitchen table, in the quiet moment when someone decides your trust is worth more to them broken than it ever was intact. I told her I was not going to ask her to testify against her own parents, that this was not her burden to carry. She looked at me across that small table, 21 years old, and already understanding something I had taken 61 years to learn, and told me that silence was exactly what had let her father get away with it the first time, and she was not going to be the reason it happened to 11 more families before it stopped. 3 days later, my foundation, which by then had quietly grown into a network supporting legal aid and financial recovery for elder fraud victims across 4 states, was scheduled to host its annual benefit gala downtown. A night meant to celebrate the recovery cases we had funded that year, meant to bring investors and city officials and honorees together to raise money for the next round of legal defense funds. I had planned to give a short, unremarkable speech about the work ahead. Instead, I decided that night would be the moment the wall I had built for 12 years finally came all the way down, publicly, deliberately, on my own terms, in front of the exact kind of investors and journalists whose trust Derek was currently trying to rebuild in a desperate attempt to save Legacy Bridge before the state attorney general's office formally filed charges. I called Derek myself for the first time in 12 years. I told him, in a voice as calm and steady as I could manage, that I wanted to meet, that I was willing to discuss what he called help, that he and Renee should come to the gala as my guests. I told him to dress well. He believed me. That was the part that told me everything I still needed to know about whether he had changed at all in 12 years. He believed that all it would take was one calm phone call, and his father, the same man he had once assumed would quietly fade away into an unremarkable old age, would simply open the door and let him walk back in. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel downtown was lit gold that night, the kind of soft, expensive lighting that makes everyone in a room look 10 years younger and considerably more trustworthy than they actually are. 600 guests filled the floor, investors in tailored suits, city council members, journalists with press badges clipped to lapels, and a dozen families whose homes had been saved through the legal defense fund my foundation quietly financed, sitting at reserved tables near the front, wearing the careful, grateful smiles of people who had come close to losing everything, and had not Derek and Renee arrived exactly on time. Which did not surprise me. Derek had always understood the value of a good entrance. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him well enough to suggest new money, and Renee wore deep burgundy, her hair pulled back, her smile aimed at every camera she passed on her way to the front row I had reserved for them. They stopped twice to shake hands with strangers, introducing themselves as the son and daughter-in-law of Walter Doyle, letting the name do exactly the work Derek intended it to do. I watched them from the mezzanine above the main floor, the same vantage point I had used at smaller events for years, the place where I could see a room before the room saw me. Marcus stood at my side, quiet, watching the crowd with the flat, professional attention of a man who had spent 2 weeks building a case file. Gus stood a few feet away, arms crossed, saying nothing, because Gus had learned a long time ago that some nights do not need commentary until the moment they do. A financial reporter near the stage spotted Derek working the room and drifted over with a microphone, asking, on record, whether he was here tonight to formally announce a partnership between Legacy Bridge Advisory and his father's foundation, given the sudden press interest in both companies over the past week. Derek did not flinch. He smiled the same warm, practiced smile I remembered from the week his mother died, and told the reporter that his father and he had, in his words, a complicated history that we're working through as a family, and that he was proud, genuinely proud, to watch his father's legacy grow into something that helped people. He said he hoped that tonight might be the beginning of the two companies working more closely together, for the good of the seniors they both claimed to serve. I heard every word of it clearly from the mezzanine. The acoustics of that ballroom carried voices up to me the same way. Another ballroom, in another life, had once carried voices to another man standing above another crowd. I felt, for one strange moment, the echo of every version of this story that has ever been lived by a father standing above a son who thought his silence meant surrender. A young reporter near the base of the staircase glanced up and spotted me watching from above. Word rippled outward fast, the way it always does in a room full of people who make their living noticing things. Within a minute, dozens of faces had turned upward, including Derek's. I watched his composure flicker, just slightly, a half-second of something uncertain passing behind his eyes, before the confident mask slid back into place. He looked up at me and offered a small, hopeful nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he still believes, after everything, that his father is about to save him one more time. I did not go down immediately. I let the moment stretch the way I had learned, over 12 years, that moments like this need to stretch. I let him stand in that spotlight of his own, choosing a little longer. Let him feel the warmth of a room that still believed, for now, that he was exactly who he claimed to be. When I finally walked down to the stage, the applause was warm and genuine, built on 12 years of real work, real recovered homes, real families sitting in that room because a legal defense fund had fought for them when no one else would. I let that applause settle before I spoke, because everything I was about to say needed to be heard against the backdrop of what my foundation actually stood for. I began the way I always began at these events, thanking the donors, thanking the legal team, introducing two of the families in the front row whose homes had been saved that year through cases eerily similar to my own. I watched Derek smile hold steady through all of it, patient, waiting for his cue. Then I told them the story I have just told you, not in careful, protected language, in full. I told 600 people, live, on the record, in front of a dozen cameras, about a kitchen table 5 weeks after my wife's funeral, about a stack of papers I signed without reading, about $380,000 wired out of a house I had already paid for once. I did not name Derek at first. I let the story build the way a fuse builds toward a flame, and I watched the color drain slowly out of my son's face as he began to understand, syllable by syllable, that this was not the reunion he had walked into that ballroom expecting. "The man who did this to me," I said, my voice carrying clean and steady over the silent room, used my grief the way a thief uses an unlocked door. He knew exactly what he was doing. And 12 years later, when the world finally started paying attention to the good this foundation has done, when reporters started asking questions about a company called Legacy Bridge Advisory, I learned something that broke my heart in a way I did not think was still possible at 73 years old. I learned that the man who forged my signature on that loan did not stop after he destroyed my life. He built an entire company on the same method. He has spent the last 8 months doing to 11 other families exactly what he once did to his own father. Renee's champagne glass slipped out of her hand and shattered against the marble floor. The sound seemed to echo for a full second before the room erupted into a wave of gasps and rising camera flashes. Derek stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward Renee, toward me, searching for some version of this moment he could still control. He found his voice before I expected him to. "This is insane," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly, his composure cracking into something rawer and angrier. "You don't know what you're talking about. Legacy Bridge helps people. I built that company to help people. Dad, the same way you built yours. You want to stand up there and act like some kind of saint after you cut me off for 12 years? After you let me think you'd lost everything? You let me believe you were struggling, and this whole time you were sitting on a fortune, judging me from a distance instead of ever picking up the phone." It was, I will admit, a well-constructed deflection, twisting a decade of silence I had chosen for my own protection into an accusation of cruelty. A few faces in the crowd looked genuinely uncertain for a moment, the story suddenly less clean than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Derek had always understood, better than almost anyone I have known, how to make his own wrongdoing feel like the natural consequence of someone else's coldness. That was the exact moment. The heavy doors at the rear of the ballroom opened. Mia walked in, wearing a plain navy dress, no jewelry, no practiced smile, carrying a single manila folder pressed against her chest. She did not look at her father as she crossed the length of that ballroom. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on me, walking with the same deliberate, steady purpose I had once told her, in a coffee shop 3 days earlier, was the only real antidote to a lifetime of being told what to believe. Derek's face went white in a completely different way than it had a moment before. "Mia," he said, his voice cracking, "what are you doing here? This isn't. You shouldn't be part of this." Mia stopped at the edge of the stage. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to, because by then the room had gone almost completely silent, waiting. "I found the court records myself, Dad," she said. "I found the notarization records. I found the wire transfers. I found the 11 families you've done this to since. I spent 3 days deciding whether loving you meant staying quiet, and I decided it doesn't. It never did." She turned to face the crowd of investors and reporters, holding up the folder. "My name is Mia Doyle. Everything my grandfather just told you is true, and I can prove every part of it that he hasn't already." She climbed the short steps onto the stage and placed the folder in my hands. Inside it were printed copies of the State Attorney General's preliminary findings, quietly shared with her 2 days earlier by an investigator who had reached out after her original public records search had helped flag the pattern, along with a personal letter Renee had written to Mia 8 months earlier, boasting, in Renee's own handwriting, about how well Legacy Bridge's first quarter had gone, and how relieved she was that Derek had finally found, in her words, "a business model that actually works." I did not have to read a single line of it aloud. Marcus, standing at the base of the stage, had already signaled to 2 men near the rear service doors, men in plain gray suits who had been waiting quietly through the entire evening, coordinating with local law enforcement stationed just outside. The state investigators moved through the stunned crowd with the same calm, synchronized purpose, I imagine. Every guilty man secretly fears will someday walk through a door meant for him. Derek saw them coming before Renee did. He looked at his daughter standing beside me on that stage, and something in his expression finally broke all the way through, not into remorse, not yet, but into the specific cornered panic of a man watching every version of the story he had built for himself collapse in real time. In front of every camera in the room, Renee tried to bolt for the side exit near the bar, her heels catching on the hem of her burgundy dress. But a hotel security guard stepped calmly into her path before she covered 10 feet. She did not scream or fight the way I imagined she might. She simply stopped, chest heaving, and looked back at Derek with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had worn a version of it myself 12 years earlier at that kitchen table. It was the look of someone finally understanding that the person they had built their entire life around had been quietly building a trap the whole time, and that the trap had just closed. Derek did not run. I think some part of him, even then, still believed a version of this story existed where his father's love was larger than his father's evidence. He turned to me instead, ignoring the investigators closing in, and said the only thing he had left. "Dad, please, whatever you think of me, I'm still your son. You can stop this. One word from you and this all goes away." I looked at him for a long moment, the same way I imagine a man looks at a house fire he has finally stopped trying to put out with his bare hands. "You stopped being the boy I raised the day you decided my grief was a resource," I said. "This isn't me stopping loving you, Derek. This is me finally loving the 11 families you haven't ruined yet, more than I love the idea of a son who never really existed." The lead investigator read him his rights on that stage, in front of 600 witnesses and a dozen cameras that would replay the moment on local news for the following 3 nights. Wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, 4 documented counts with 7 more under active investigation, forgery of notarized instruments, Conspiracy, that last charge extending to Renee, whose marketing materials and internal emails had made her participation impossible to frame as ignorance. The case moved faster than my own had, 12 years earlier, because this time there was no grieving old man alone at a kitchen table fighting a well-funded lender by himself. There was a foundation with a full legal team, a state attorney general's office with 11 documented victims willing to testify, and forensic accounting records that Marcus's team had already assembled before Derek even understood how much ground had been lost beneath him. 6 months after that gala, a jury took less than a full day to convict Derek on all counts. Renee pleaded to a lesser set of charges in exchange for testimony that closed the final gaps in the case against him. He was sentenced to 11 years in a federal facility. 1 year, the judge noted almost poetically, for every family whose home he had touched. Renee received 18 months and 5 years of supervised financial restrictions. I visited him exactly once, 4 months into his sentence, in a visitation room with fluorescent lights and thick scratched plexiglass, the kind of room that seems designed to strip the dignity out of every conversation that happens inside it. I did not go for closure, not exactly. I went because Gus told me something the week before that stuck with me. He said a man cannot fully finish carrying a weight until he has set it down in front of the person who handed it to him. Derek looked older than his years when he sat down across from me, his prison jumpsuit hanging looser on him than I remembered his tailored suits ever doing. He picked up the phone on his side of the glass, and I picked up mine. He apologized at first, in the practiced, rehearsed way I had expected. He told me the stress had built up slowly. He told me he had never meant for it to become what it became. He told me prison was hard, that he thought about Mia every day, that he wished things had gone differently. I let him talk until he ran out of words, the same way I once let him talk in a different room, a different lifetime. Then I reached into my jacket and set 2 things on the small shelf on my side of the divider, close enough to the glass that he could see them clearly. The first was a $1 bill. The second was a photocopy of the original forged loan application, the one Marcus had kept in that fireproof lockbox for 12 years. My forged signature, circled in red ink exactly where the notary's stamp sat beside it. "You built an entire company convincing strangers that taking someone's home is help," I said. I kept this $1 to remind myself of the only thing that was ever actually true between us. You didn't need $380,000 from me that year, Derek. You needed one honest conversation at that kitchen table, and you decided a forged signature was easier to get than my trust would have been if you'd simply asked for it. He stared at the dollar for a long time. He did not ask me for money that day, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. Maybe it was the first honest moment I ever witnessed from him. Or maybe he had simply finally understood there was nothing left to ask for. I stood up before he could say anything else, hung the receiver back on its hook, and walked out of that visitation room without looking back. The same way I imagine every parent eventually has to walk away from the version of their child that exists only in memory. Now, Maya's life took a different shape entirely in the years that followed. She finished her degree the same semester her father's trial concluded, and instead of the corporate law path she had originally planned, she asked me for one thing, and only one thing, when she graduated. She did not ask for money. She asked for a job, an actual job, at the foundation, starting at the bottom, processing intake calls from elderly victims of exactly the kind of fraud her father had committed twice. I told her the position paid an honest, modest salary, that she would answer phones and file paperwork, and sit with frightened strangers, explaining their legal options, and that there would be no fast track simply because her last name was Doyle. She told me that was exactly what she wanted. For 3 years now, she has shown up at that intake desk 5 days a week, and she has become, according to every case manager who works alongside her, one of the most trusted voices in that entire office, because the families who call in sensing shame and fear can hear, somehow, that she genuinely understands what it costs to have your trust weaponized by someone who was supposed to protect you. The foundation itself grew into something I could not have imagined on that first quiet morning after the phone rang. We renamed the legal defense program the Homeline Trust, a name Mia suggested herself, a quiet nod to the exact landline that had first exposed what her father had done. Today it funds forensic legal teams in 6 states, has helped reverse or block fraudulent lie-ins on over 400 homes, and trains bank employees nationally to recognize the specific warning signs. Gus first taught me by instincts in a bank lobby 12 years earlier, the mobile notary visits, the rushed signatures during a family crisis, the sudden new power of attorney appearing weeks after a spouse's death. In the main lobby of our headquarters, behind a small pane of reinforced glass, sits a modest display that most visitors walk past without a second glance unless someone tells them what it means. A single dollar bill, a photocopy of a forged loan application with a circled signature, and beside them, an old rotary-style kitchen phone, the same model, though not the actual unit, as the one that rang on my wall at 6:14 in the morning all those years ago. There is a small plaque beneath it that Mia wrote herself. It reads, "The call that finally told the truth was answered by a landline nobody thought still mattered. Answer yours. I still keep an apartment not far from the old house, smaller than my office, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of place a man can sit with a cup of coffee and simply exist without any title attached to his name." Some evenings, Mia comes by after work, and we sit on the small back porch and talk about nothing important. Cases from her week, a book she's reading, whether the tomatoes I've started growing in a cracked ceramic pot are ever going to actually ripen. She told me something on that porch a few months ago that I have not been able to shake since. She said the hardest lesson her father ever taught her without meaning to was that love without honesty is just a longer, more patient version of theft. And the second hardest lesson, the one she said she was still learning every single day at that intake desk, was that the only real way to undo what a thief takes from you is to spend the rest of your life making sure it never happens quietly to anyone else again. I think about that phone ringing on the wall some mornings still, the way you think about a scar on your own hand. Not with fresh pain anymore, just with quiet recognition of exactly what it cost and exactly what it taught you. A house is just wood and drywall and a mortgage number on a piece of paper. What my son actually stole from me that year was 12 quiet years of trust, and it took every one of those 12 years, working in near total silence, to build something strong enough to answer that theft honestly, instead of bitterly. If there is one thing I would want another person sitting alone at their own kitchen table to understand tonight, it is this. The people who love you the most will never need to forge your signature to get your help. If someone you love is quietly asking you to sign things you have not fully read, in a moment when you are too tired or too grieving to read them closely, that is not family taking care of business. That is the oldest theft in the world, wearing the softest possible disguise.